Well, thanks, Nick, for joining us here on Stacking Victories. Hopefully, a labor of love, in this process. This the very first episode, so grateful for you, being a guest, and excited to see what God does with this. So,
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you very much for having me, and I'm honored and humbled to be your first guest and help break the ice. So let's get to it.
All right, awesome. So, earlier we were just talking about journey and what that means. Journey of life, journey through recovery, journey in our walk with God, and so excited again about you sharing your life story with everybody, and with that, we start life from the very beginning when we're born. So, tell me what about your childhood, growing up, kind of where that happened, if there was a bunch of moves or siblings, relationships with mom, dad, all that stuff.
Absolutely. Well, that's quite a lot to unpack, so I'll give the abbreviated version. But I am, I look back at my life and recognize that I had a pretty good start to life. Um, Eventually, as the oldest of 10 kids, there was a lot of pressure to perform and a lot of self-imposed expectation that I put on myself, which is key to my story because that's kind of underpins what brings me here today. Um, but unlike so many stories that I hear in the rooms, I had a pretty good upbringing. My parents still together, coming up on 44 years of wedded bliss. And for the most part, our family is pretty close knit. Like any family, we've got our drama and we've got some things that we're working through. One of us is the black sheep, um, but that background definitely gave me a lot of support and feeling like I belonged somewhere, which was good. But in my early experience, I think looking back, hindsight being clearer, I recognized that I suffered from a certain amount of neglect, which was probably one of the first real, I guess you could say, realizations that I had in recovery, that something was amiss, that I didn't have something in my life, and so I filled it with something else. Not because my parents didn't do everything that they could and didn't love me, but because they literally had no time.
Okay.
And I had to grow up quick. I became kind of a second or a third parent, if you will, an extension of my parents to my siblings. Did a lot of not just babysitting, but I was kind of there for the siblings a lot. Um, Early on, that was good, but as I got older, some of my character defects came into play, and I became a bully. I became very manipulative. I could see that early on, I started to recognize if I played my cards right, I could get what I wanted at the expense of my siblings. So it ended up being fairly toxic. I was part of that toxicity. Um, and I would say that also something that I've realized is we did have a certain amount of instability. You mentioned traveling and moving around. We kind of had a military child experience, even though my dad wasn't active in the military at the time. He's former military, but he is a college professor. And growing up, he was studying, he was teaching, he was giving talks, and we moved around a lot. We spent a lot of time abroad in Italy. And when we did get back to the States, I was well into my junior, senior year of high school before we settled down, and I could actually branch out from the family and make friends outside of the home that were going to be there for any period of time. So that was destabilizing, and it put a lot of pressure on me. Um, some of the pressure was self-imposed, where I felt the expectation from my parents and from my siblings to perform as the oldest, as the kind of the guinea pig for different types of homeschooling or different activities to keep us involved. I was kind of the de facto leader for that. the experimental, will this work for Nick? And if so, it'll work for the rest. And a big part of that, like I said, was self-imposed, but it came from this sense, I think it was a good sense. I wanted to be a good kid. I wanted to gain the approval of others. But like so many character defects in the addict's mind, I took it too far, to the point where it wasn't long before everything I touched became about me and became about showing to the world that I was better, that I could, achieve, and the approval I received from others became what I measured my self-worth from, whether it was my parents, teachers, people we met outside, my friends circle, even though that wasn't very big, even until college. The few people that I glommed onto, I did so in a way that was unhealthy. A lot of those relationships growing up were kind of this house of cards that I built for myself of what can I get out of this interaction. So, yeah, that growing up experience was probably carried through into college. I mentioned we were homeschooled. I had a lot of time at home, but my parents did everything they could to get us involved in extracurricular activities, so that was beneficial. One extracurricular activity that I think has helped me be successful in life is entrepreneurship. My parents definitely pushed myself and my brother, the two oldest, to get out and about, get work, do jobs, come up with ways to contribute to the family. And that benefited me in my upbringing in that it gave me a very entrepreneurial spirit. Being the oldest, I was naturally inclined to go out and do things on my own, figure it out. And the irony of that is it also put me in a lot of danger, a lot of unsupervised activity outside the home at a young age. And that's where I first encountered pornography, while I was cleaning out an apartment it was actually my grandma owned a series of apartments, and my brother and I were tasked with going in after, a vacate to clean up. And I found my first box of smut.
So around what age was that?
I was probably 11.
Okay.
Yeah, 11 or 12. So, and like I mentioned, my family environment was good, but this was something that I didn't think I could really talk to anybody about. There was an unspoken taboo that sex was, a naughty topic, that it was not to be, addressed. It was somehow bad. Even though, growing up in a very religious-centered environment, the recognition that marriage is instituted by Christ and a beautiful thing, that bringing life into the world is what that's meant to do. The actual the actual physical act and what being exposed to that did to me immediately felt like I was doing something wrong. But it was exciting and it got hold of me right away.
Okay. So you said it was sort of this unspoken taboo in the household. What were some of the things that, outside of sort of the religious upbringing and the expectation of bringing life into the world and what that looks like, was there any actions or stuff that you saw in your parents or your to them and to your other siblings, or just something that put that in your mind of like, this isn't good. I can't talk about this.
That's a good question. I think the most impactful environment, I guess you could, piece of that relationship is that my parents did have a pretty clear set of boundaries, morally speaking, in the family. So, they very quickly, identified and addressed bad language, you know, disrespectful actions. So, you know, it was clear growing up that there were certain boundaries you didn't cross. My parents would, you know, punish you, rightfully so, and they never did anything out of anger. But in finding this incredibly captivating and intimately, you know, kind of exciting material that I knew my parents would nix, that conflicting with the fact that I wanted it, that I was like, I don't want to let this go, right? Automatically became a source of justification for myself that I don't need to say anything. Because I knew if I did, it would get taken away. I'd get a lecture, right? So it wasn't that, you know, I had built up any, you know, bad ideas about sexuality. But I recognized in this moment, looking back, it's clear. At the time, I was just going with the flow. Mm-hmm. But that flow said, don't show anybody or it'll go away.
Okay. So you find it, 11 years old, you kind of had a vague understanding of sex. Was there ever a talk from dad or mom or both about sex, sort of the birds and the bees, if you will?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think my dad had the birds and the bees talk when I was about 13. So a couple years had passed since, you know, I first encountered pornography. By that time, I wasn't fully engrossed in the addiction, as it were. It was definitely something that was moldering in the background. But by that time, I hadn't yet fully developed the compulsion. Okay. I definitely sought it out. I was definitely hiding. I was kind of building my stash, as it were. So when my dad approached me, kind of in the back of my mind, I was chuckling. Kind of, I know what this is about. I know what he's going to say. Right. And there was a part of me that was saying, you know, I know more than my dad by now. Because in my mind, my dad didn't, you know, imbibe. You know, he wasn't, it wasn't my dad's stash that I found. And I've, you know, to this day, I know this was not his proclivity. It turned out to be mine. But in my mind, I was like, well, you know, my dad's a bit of a prude, so he doesn't really know what I know. So I think that, and I appreciate you asking that question, because I'm realizing right now, a little, you know, birdie in my mind's telling me this is something I'm going to take to prayer and journal about, because I don't think I've ever thought about this particular feature of the relationship. But in having that, you know, back of the mind, or I was telling myself that I knew more than my dad at that point. Even right now, sitting here, I'm having the realization that that might have been the point at which I started taking their advice and their outreach for help later in life for granted. Because I knew better. Or so I thought. So, it's a good question.
So the relationship with the siblings, I know you talked about, you know, sort of being there to watch over them, help raise them, you know, I guess sort of fill in whatever, you know, phrase fits for that. But and then you mentioned, you know, at some point, you know, it turned into bullying. Some of them, all of them, you know. So I guess today's day and age, there's a lot of you know, talk of bullying, and rightly so. There's a lot of that stuff that happens. So as it pertains to, I guess, sort of common knowledge nowadays, is that an idea of, you know, how it was for you growing up? Was it you know, was it sort of physical bullying? Was it more, you know, sort of intellectual bullying? You know, what did that look like?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's insidious about an addiction is that, in my experience at least, it made me incredibly manipulative. And part of that manipulation was figuring out and perfecting the art of not getting caught. You know, so physical abuse was out of the picture, right? There was always a clear indication that someone hit another person. And that doesn't mean that we didn't get in fights. My brother and I, we would fight like cats and dogs. We're best friends now, but I think that was kind of the healthy, two boys growing up, oldest of, a gaggle of kids, and we would duke it out sometimes. But the bullying that I identify with now and recognize I was, bringing into the life of my siblings was emotional, mental. It was the mind game of, well, Nick can make this happen, get what he wants, and I'm the scapegoat. And so there was this unspoken sense of power that I had, a power dynamic, and it was one that controlled situations using fear, using other different social levers, blackmail, saying, hey, if you do this, here are the consequences. Like, I'll tell mom that, and lay out a scenario where, my sibling has no recourse but to, give in. So it was pretty insidious in that regard. And a lot of the time it was really just to cover my tracks. It was to lay the groundwork for explaining why I, didn't come home for dinner, or, spent so much time in my room, or, could get access to things that, my parents generally kept under close supervision, like the internet, right? I would figure out, I would spend a lot of time scheming on how I could get me time in a big family like that, where I shared a room with 4 other siblings. So,
Well, growing up, families, it's not all the, sort of the doom and gloom and the, the sadness or the bad, quote unquote bad things that we do. I mean, there's joy, there's happiness, there's excitement, there's adventure. What are some childhood memories, even into, teenage years, that jump out as far as, fun times with the family, whether as a whole or, individual, time shared.
I appreciate you, pointing that out, because we had an amazing childhood, ostensibly. When I look at it and take a step back from my stuff, and the negatives, it was amazing. We traveled the world. We had an opportunity to experience many different cultures, and get involved in them. My mom was very good at making sure we were involved in, the community. We had, the exposure to festivals and, excursions. So, and enough of that too, that even when it was all of us together, we had a buddy system down. And I think it was a point of, I kind of want to say like national pride, right? Family pride, that we could go out as a group to a nice restaurant or to church or to whatever and present as being a very unified front. All us kids got along. We had our buddy system, and things just moved smoothly. I think my parents were proud of that, and us kids too were proud of that. We were, very aware that that was a dynamic that we could participate in. And, we would do things as a family, whether it was small things like arts and crafts or raising guinea pigs and goats and stuff like that, to going out to, the Ren Fair, or, larger excursions to take, road trips up to the mountains or something like that. My brothers and I would go camping. So we had a lot of those experiences. And we also were blessed with family who lived in all different parts of the states, other countries. We'd visit them. A lot of my fondest memories are of us traveling to see other, extended family, aunts and uncles, grandparents. Family events were always a big draw for everybody to come together. So, I can remember a lot of fond memories with my siblings and cousins, attending weddings, even funerals. Us kids knew how to party, um, and we'd have a lot of time together. So yeah, lot to look back on and add to the gratitudes list. So
Well, I know one of the things that you're involved in now is and have been for many years is wrenching on motorcycles. You're doing repairs to cars and just very much into the so the mechanical side of things. Where did that was that something that was birthed and begun in childhood, and if so, what did that look like?
well, growing up, I was in addition to being put into a environment like I mentioned before of entrepreneurial spirit, going out and figuring it out on your own. I've always been a analytical, kind of mechanically inclined person. As a kid, I was the one that lined up all my cars and organized my Legos by size and shape, and I'd spend more time doing that, and I would get so involved in the prep and the setup. That was where I found enjoyment. Building the thing was kind of like icing on the cake, but organization and figuring out how things worked. One of my favorite, I guess you could say, reading pastimes, aside from the classic fictions like the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit type of stuff. Uh, I loved reading how-to manuals. Believe it or not, I was that kid that liked to go to the thrift store and find the the 1956 Mustang service manual and just devour it. Like I would read everything about it. So that was one thing. There was the mental and kind of where I got my jollies, if you will, from an intellectual standpoint. I loved that stuff. And then I also had the benefit of family and friends and neighbors who were involved in mechanical things, whether it was diesel shop that I would spend time at, or bike shops, bicycle, maintenance and repair, and then of course our own garage was, as I got older, probably from around the same time as I first encountered pornography. Um, I mentioned that we had spent a lot of time in Italy, so we were back and forth between Italy and the States until I was probably junior in high school, or just about to be, the equivalent of, because we were homeschooled. Mm-hmm. But in that time, when we would come back to the States, that's what I would get involved in, is wrenching on things. We being a big family, we could never afford the new thing, but I became the default fixer of the secondhand bike that we got, for one of my siblings or for myself or whatever. And so, my parents, I think, recognized that, and so found opportunity to bring things into the home that I could fix or build from scratch given the right material. So that was a big part of it as well. And I appreciate this particular aspect of, or looking at this aspect, because it illustrates to me part of my story and part of my experience with addiction, and especially the non-chemical kind of soul and mental addiction, such as sex addiction and compulsive behaviors towards masturbation and pornography. All of that turned myself inward to the point where a lot of those hobbies that I loved and would really benefit from became too time consuming or too distracting, or they didn't serve the purpose that I was after, which was to get me time, right? Or to find a way to deal with the pressures of of life, and relieve stress or whatever. So from the time I was in, say, high school forward, a lot of that fell to the background, and some of it went away completely. Stopped reading my manuals. I barely did any, fix-it stuff, except maybe when my mom would call me in a panic because, the pipes had burst, right? And it wasn't until recovery, or me discovering recovery and getting help from a therapist, that I was able to rediscover that. So when, moving forward in my story, encountering that point in my life where all of my consequences have come to bear and I need help. Not only did I find the rooms, not of my own accord, but I also got into therapy. And one of the, very early on, the therapist that I was working with identified that, hey, you had all these hobbies and things that were very healthy for you, and that, where did they go? What happened to that? And digging into it, recognized that I had replaced them with pornography and masturbation and selfish things, right? And it was only in identifying that I could really recognize that, hey, that is a very important part of my life. I may actually have a calling there, because that coincides with recovery also opening myself up to the possibility of a relationship with a higher power, a relationship with other people that's not self-centered. And my love for wrenching on anything, kind of gravitated towards small engines and motorcycles, actually became not only a way that I could do something healthy for myself, but I could pay it forward. I could start sharing that experience with others.
Okay. Well, that's a good teaser for later on in the story when we get to that point. So
Absolutely.
Appreciate you putting that out there. So I think we've covered it, maybe to an exhaustive level, the early childhood. So you graduate, high school, you move on to college. Did you go away to college? Did you live at home and commute into college? What was, and sort of the college experience, how did that look, to you, and where did and how did the sex addiction, play a role in, college life, and, were there any other isms, so to speak, of the addiction world? Did any of that sort of get identified, or, as you've looked back on your story, can you see any of that sort of happening there?
Well, I was very lucky. Mentioned before, my dad was or is a college professor. So I attended the college he was teaching at. And that benefited me in that I avoided racking up a ton of student debt. I did take out some FAFSA loans for books and material and extracurricular activities over the course of my college tenure, but that was, I think, beneficial in the long run because I didn't have to go away, but I was able to live on campus and off campus just far enough away that I was outside of my kind of family sphere, and I could branch out and officially leave the home. I think it would have been unhealthy for me to be so close to home that I was never left that environment. So I count myself lucky. I think that was a blessing in many ways. Also, the college that I attended was very faith-centered and allowed me to be surrounded by people who were a positive influence on my life. And I think that was one of many, God shots, if you will, that kept me from, going completely off the rails very early on. And also probably saved my life in the long run. When it came to how the addiction mentality manifested itself in other isms, I was, as I mentioned before, very self-centered. So the self-ism, perfectionism, workaholism, that was definitely layered on to the sexaholism. They in my life, those were symbiotic. One fueled the other. And it was definitely a cycle that progressively got worse. progressively pushed me to extremes, to perform, to put out the facade of the perfect life, while inwardly I'm scrambling to, keep all of my plates spinning. Whether it was the lies I was telling, the manipulations I had to keep going, you name it. It's absolute chaos. And that really my college life was that. I didn't do well in school. D for diploma was where I was at. And there were certain subjects that I was really good at because I liked it, because I felt this was where I needed to be. I started out pursuing an engineering degree. Quickly realized that was boring, and all of my friends were getting into computers. So I switched in my freshman year, almost right off the bat, to get into computer science. And my core curriculum was excellent. Like, I did great at that. And then everything else was just, barely getting by. So I didn't do myself any favors by that. Um, and I justified a lot of it by saying, well, school isn't for me. I'll get what I need out of it, but I'm going to do my own thing. And so I did. I started a business while I was in college, split my time. And while it was ostensibly successful, it wasn't a good use of my time, looking back.
Tell us some more about that business. What was involved in that?
Yeah, it was basically kind of the Geek Squad before the Geek Squad was cool with Best Buy. But it was focused on providing technical support to campus students, in the mid to early 2000s. College campuses were still getting caught up on student-owned technology. So a lot of the campuses in the area wouldn't touch your personal machine if it needed support. Whether it was insurance related or whatever, they typically didn't support it. You either had used campus equipment in the labs, or if you had your own, you were on your own to go off campus and get it serviced. And a lot of times that was too expensive for the college kid. So the business was aimed at working with the universities, whether it was your JCC down the road or other campuses in the region, to rent space on campus, employ members of the student body, and essentially provide technical support. So the niche was there. What ended up being our primary and most powerful revenue generator, though, was audio-visual setups for sports teams and frat parties. So we spent a lot of our time doing the tech work behind the scenes, and ended up we didn't intend it to go that way, but that's where we made all the money.
So what does a frat party need audio-visual for? I never was in a fraternity, so I don't know what that's.
Oh man, everything from their party lights to big screens during tailgates and you name it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
All right. So you've got the entrepreneurship going. You've got the D for diploma going. You've got just college life happening. How is the sexaholism, the porn, the lust? How's that exploding? Beyond where it was before getting into college.
Well, one, besides being incredibly time consuming, college was where I fully entered the dating scene. I really hadn't dabbled in it in high school, and part of that was because I was still very much connected with the home front. I went to a private high school for my junior and senior year, and it was a very regimented environment. So I didn't date. It was just wasn't a thing. But in college, I definitely had an interest, and I definitely pursued what I thought were potential relationships. But in high school, it never really panned out. In college is where I was fully free to date and strike up relationships with females. And so I wouldn't say I went full bore. I didn't go absolutely crazy, because part of my manipulative behavior was keeping up this facade of the good boy, right? So there were even a couple girls who, when I first introduced myself and we got to know each other, I would say something like, no sex before marriage, or I would make some sort of boundary statement that, hey, I'm a good guy, you don't have to worry about me. But I would use that relationship and the time that I spent with that person to fuel my self-worth and my sense of accomplishment, and be like, hey, I was able to get this one. And not so much in a physical sense, because I would satisfy myself on the side. Mm-hmm. But it was just very unhealthy in that regard. So the relationships that I formed were paper thin. They were really just about me. And whether it was relationships I had with girlfriends, or the guys I was living with, or whatever, were all very very self-centered. I surrounded myself with people who didn't question me. Right. I made sure that I was a leader in the clique, as it were, and that I could have influence, so that I could get what I wanted. And that's, I think, where the addiction for me really took off, and the chasm between the life I presented to others and my interior life really widened. And it was in college where I met my first wife. And even though I had these physical boundaries with other people set, it was in meeting her that, and in my junior and senior year of college, that I really started to break those boundaries. And, in the addiction process, we talk about breaking boundaries, the nevers that come to be. And that's where that took off. So in meeting her, I met someone who was also broken. Mm-hmm. We both came into the relationship with different types of brokenness in our families, in ourselves. And so she and I coming together was like gasoline and fire, right? Both passionate, both driven, and both right on the brink of throwing caution to the wind. And so we did. And that was my first sexual encounter with a woman, outside of pornography, of course. And it didn't take us long to basically break all the boundaries that either of us had. And it was through that relationship that we got pregnant, and in an attempt to cover that, we quickly got married. And so that's where, that was the college experience. And we got married just after I graduated. She was about to graduate.
Okay. So, yeah. Well, before we jump into sort of the first marriage in life after college, I'm also curious about one of the isms that you mentioned, being the perfectionism. So typically, in addiction, I know that's how it is with me, that sort of chasing that ultimate high. So whether that's through alcohol or pornography, or if somebody's addicted to drugs, or workaholism, all these other things, I'm curious to see what that looks like for perfectionism. What is that sort of ultimate high that one chases in being perfect?
I think it's, for me, perfectionism wasn't so much a high, but it was a motivator. Both positively and negatively enforcing. On the positive side, when things went well, when things went according to plan, I was confirmed that my plan worked, that I did the thing I set out to do. It was an accomplishment badge, if you will. Right? So the perfectionism says, you did that. You pulled all those strings. Good job. Right? Pat myself on the back. On the negative side, it was, don't fuck this up. Right? Don't mess this up. Do it right. These are the consequences for failing. And then if I failed, and a lot of times my metric for myself of what failure looked like was like a low bar. I could beat myself up over the smallest thing. And so there was this huge negative motivator that came from the perfectionism that drove me to do things. And a lot of times that was shame driven, And I would say that the perfectionism manifested itself more often in the negative. In hindsight, looking back at an event or something I said or an interaction I had with another person and picking it apart. Finding those things that I could say, Nick, you messed up and here's how. With the justification in the back saying, all right, this is kind of my self-exam to get better next time. When really all I'm doing is treading water in my own crap. Right? It's never got better, right? Because I was trying to do everything on my own and never let anyone else into that. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know. We've mentioned God very, very briefly, through this, and before sort of jumping out of school life and into adult life. You grew up going to church. Your dad being a professor in a religious school, I think you said, and so where did your understanding of God, where did that sort of begin as far as sort of first memories, as far as God as an idea or sort of the in abstract, and then if it happened before sort of adulthood, where did the relationship of between you and Christ happen? And if that's after adulthood, then we'll hold that for later in the story.
Well, I think it's apropos that up to this point in the thread of our conversation, God hasn't come up much because he wasn't there much.
Okay.
Right. He was there in the sense that my dad was a theology professor, very well versed in Scripture and in the understanding of, or the interpretation thereof, of our faith. We're Catholic. And being brought up in that environment, I had a lot of intellectual knowledge. I had a lot of intellectual, conceptual understanding of what I'm supposed to do as a Catholic, as a Christian, what is right and what is wrong. I could, being a smart kid, I could read you the textbook answer to any question given about my faith. But I didn't live it. I didn't internalize it. The relationship that I had with God was very distant. And my understanding of God was kind of, the authoritarian figure, the rule maker, that entity in life that was rather intangible and uninvolved, but to whom I owed allegiance. And that allegiance wasn't mine. It was more of just like the community and the environment that I was in. It said, this is how it is. So play ball. A lot of it, too, was driven by my own pride. Right? My pride said, well, I can get places and influence people using my intellectual understanding of my faith and religion. Simply because by doing that, I earn their trust, right? And I could use my religion as a levering tool to gain trust and influence people, which, as you can imagine, is very unhealthy. So God was, in many ways, up until my rediscovery of that relationship in recovery, very much a playing card, if you will.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, to just talk back to your explanation of how perfectionism played out in your life, that I would think that in having a strong relationship with God, the antithesis of that is the perfectionism piece. So they can't both coincide together. It's it's the ruling of or two masters type thing. So
Absolutely.
So it makes perfect sense then about so living into that perfectionism that God would be in the distance.
Excluded, yeah.
Yeah.
I was perfect, so I didn't need him.
Okay. Yeah. It's a very honest answer.
Yeah.
That's good. I think before we jump into adulthood, unless you have anything more to say about your life before, let's say 20. If there's anything else you have with that, we can cover that now, and then I think it'd be a good time to take a break.
All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of exchange Q&A on this pre-recovery or pre-adulthood piece, because every time I have a chance to have a dialogue with someone, I learn something new. I think we touched on one aspect earlier where I identified that moment that I kind of started taking my parents' advice and wisdom for granted. Another thing that's kind of come to mind is recognizing that the lack of that relationship with a higher power was very much, and I don't put words to, I've recognized it before, but what I'm recognizing for myself today, now in this conversation, is I haven't really put words to it before. In that the void I was trying to fill with all the other me stuff, starting with pornography and masturbation, but then with, accomplishments and other people's, accolades, was ultimately the lack of that relationship. I didn't really have one. There was an intellectual knowledge, and I used that to justify. I know God. I know what this is all about. I can talk the Catholic talk, right? But it was vapid. It was just empty, and so I was filling something that couldn't really be filled by material things. So,
yeah, makes perfect sense. Okay, well, with that, we'll take a break, and then when we come back, we'll jump into adulthood.
all right.
Before we took the break, mentioned about moving into the first marriage, and so you sort of set it up. Last time we were talking about college, about how so getting you're pregnant, and then trying to cover it up, so to speak, with quickly getting married. So,
Sure.
What did that? Was that like a run to the courthouse type thing, or did you let parents know about it? And there's a traditional ceremony. What's that look like?
Well, we initially mutually decided if we can keep this secret long enough, get right under the wire in setting up a traditional marriage, or a traditional wedding ceremony and everything like that. But it became quickly evident that not only was she going to present soon, but we're going to have to talk to the folks. So we did. After the engagement, after we had already kind of announced that, hey, we're getting married and we have a date, we did essentially confess. We told the truth. And it was interesting because my parents knew. They could tell. My mom had plenty of experience. She could tell that we were expecting before we even could tell, I think. So it's interesting too, because I've had this realization with my therapist and with my sponsor in the past, that when in recovery, in clearing my mind of all of the junk and building relationships that are founded on truth, it's a lot easier to go back in life and realize that God has been there the whole time, trying, knocking on the door, giving me every opportunity to come back from the brink, right? And that was one of probably the more stark examples where, as scared as I was, as nervous as we were both in kind of revealing to our parents the ultimate family shame that we'd gotten pregnant out of wedlock, my parents were still loving, right? We didn't get ostracized from the family. We didn't get all of the consequences we could have come up with. Didn't happen. What happened instead was a welcoming of this new life. We weren't absolved, right? I definitely had a stern conversation with my parents, the both of us, to say, okay, this isn't right, but know this, you're loved, and this new baby you're going to bring into the world is also loved, and we want to be here to help you build this family. At the time, that should have been a light bulb in my head to say, you know what?
Right.
This is your support group. Like, you can talk about anything with your parents, and hers for that matter, right? But no, it went right over my head at the time. Looking back, I see it. So we scrambled together a big old traditional Catholic wedding. I think we each had 8 members of our wedding party and the whole big church, and tons of guests.
So with that, you were, even though you guys were expecting, the Catholic Church still let you have the ceremony in the church?
Yeah. So actually, we got married. I'm trying to remember now. I can't remember how long before our daughter came along. But yeah, the Catholic Church. So one of the things I appreciate about the Catholic Church is that there's a series of sacraments, and one of those sacraments, these church-identified traditions instituted by Christ and passed down through the apostles, that carry, I guess you could say, official weight in the faith. One of those is the sacrament of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. The fact that you can get right with God and the church by going to confession. Essentially a step 10, right? Admitting your fault and trying to correct it. Saying, I was wrong, and this is what I'm going to do to correct it. And by being able to do that, going to confession, back in good graces, move on with life. So yeah, we were able to get married and get back on track, as it were.
Okay. So you have the ceremony, and you said the wedding party. You had 8 on each side.
Mm-hmm. Believe so.
Okay, and
yeah.
So I heard. Correct me if I'm wrong. When I heard you talk about your parents as far as the talk, before the marriage happened, and so the acceptance and the embrace, the love, the grace. What was that? Was that the same direction on her side, with her folks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they handled both. Our parents handled it differently, but the thread is the same. Ultimately, it was love and willingness to accept. Parents, specifically, I would say that as the news spread to the more extended members of the family, there were varying levels of shock and awe, as it were.
Sure.
Yeah.
Marriage, while it's still in school, I think you said that.
By the time we got married, we were both graduated.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So, and I had a job lined up, and so we kind of jumped right into married life and family. Our daughter was born, very quickly thereafter, and it was kind of a whirlwind at that point. But, from the addiction standpoint, there was definitely a piece of me that looked at this marriage as an opportunity to break away from the compulsive behavior. In my mind, I was like, well, I've got a wife now. I can have sex whenever I want. It's going to be great. I'm not going to need this other thing. So the fallacy there is that's just not true, right? The problem still exists. My erroneous, sick way of thinking, my selfishness, my character defects, they're all still there. And in many ways, I was just using this as yet another justification, another excuse, another tool to feed myself. Yeah.
So, what were your mentors, or what guidelines, or any books, or what did it look like for you entering into fatherhood and to be a dad, and or was it like so many of us, just sort of figure it out as you go along?
Well, it came very naturally, and I know I've identified with now in recovery that I do have a calling to be a father, whether that's to my own children or to other members of the community. That's very much part of my calling forward. So that didn't just happen; it's been there, and so I recognized I have a responsibility now and carry that forward. So I did, like in anything, I applied myself to it, and I don't know that I thought a lot of it. My wife at the time also came from a large family, not as large, but siblings, and she was also the oldest of her gaggle. So we kind of came into it with similar experiences and took to it very naturally, which is big part, why we ended up having 5 children. So yeah, I think it flowed fairly naturally. My approach was modeled after my folks. I don't know that we really did a lot of research or reading. We just kind of did the thing, and talked with my parents, her parents, about how to do a certain thing, whether it was our initial diaper changing to dealing with sickness and stuff like that. We had our moms there to call and give guidance.
So the whole process of building the family, having the 5 kids, any pregnancy issues through all of that, or was it five pregnancies, 5 births, no issues? Was there some pain along the way?
Definitely pain. The relationship first was built on very rocky ground. We were both in our own right selfish. We were both going at this very much in the wrong way. The wrong way being, it wasn't about fulfilling a greater purpose or meeting a calling from God or a higher power or doing the right thing by our marriage. It was more about, hey, how can we be successful at this in the eyes of the world? What do we present? And so we didn't give ourselves the opportunity to really get to know each other. So there was a lot of arguing that went on, and a character defect that made itself known in my life. It's been there, but it really didn't come out until I got married first time around, was anger. Allowing my frustration just build up over time till it would explode in all sorts of ways, comes out sideways. And so that very early on, those arguments started to just escalate and become more impactful as time went on. And in fact, over the course of our married period, which was almost 8 or 9 years, we separated a couple times. We came very close to divorce a couple times. There was a lot of trial and tribulation. And I know the kids suffered from that. Despite both of us being very clear that we didn't want to involve them, we did everything we could not to argue in front of them, right? It still came out. Yeah. So it was very, very, very rocky, traumatic in a lot of ways. Yeah. So not smooth sailing, not when I went into it initially. Reality was a lot different than the honeymoon period.
All right. So you mentioned the thought, maybe even a desire, that the addiction would go away. You're married now. You can have sex whenever you want, type thing. Which, typically in the rooms, for all of us, that's sort of the thought, and it's sort of an interesting thing for me as as I've thought about it for my own self, and then just hearing it from other people, is that right away we have that thought when it doesn't even click into us that we're immediately seeing our wife as an object, and not as a daughter of God, and somebody that we're supposed to cherish and support and protect, but immediately for it's our in the flesh porn, so to speak. So I'm sure there was probably during the honeymoon period, maybe there wasn't the porn type thing, but when did that kind of re-enter, or maybe it never left? I don't know. When did that sort of build up again, and that became now you're trying to find and create the me time again?
Yeah. Wow. Well, I know more than I did then. At the time, I'm just kind of going through the motions of staying on top of my house of cards. Hadn't fallen apart yet. It got dinged when I had to admit to my parents that we had gotten pregnant, right? But, it stayed up, And the consequences of my addiction to this point hadn't really manifested themselves in that type of detrimental impact where the jig is up. But it did manifest itself in, I think, a couple ways that this question illustrates. One, it had given me, it by this time I was full-blown addicted to porn and acting out. The unmanageability of life was near intolerable. But I was smart, I was driven, and I was willing to do anything I could to keep that going. So I managed. But it gave rise to a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, zero patience. I had a fuse that was negative, right? I mean, just anything would set me off. And also just incredibly aware of how crazy this was. So the other piece of this is I knew I had a problem, but I didn't know that I needed help, right? It didn't occur to me to reach out. Maybe in one, at points in time here and there, I can have flashes of memory where I think maybe I considered saying something to the priest, right? But then shame kicks in and keeps me from saying anything. Well, I don't want to, reveal this. If someone knew this about me, I would be rejected. It would be up. I'd be done. So I kept myself going, knowing that I didn't want this. So the idea that marriage could solve the problem for me, presupposes that I knew there was a problem to begin with. I knew it. I just couldn't put words to it. I didn't really understand what was going on. But I also could tell that I was, in a bad place, and just white knuckled it for a long time. And so you're absolutely right. Very right off the bat. I mean, before we even got engaged, there was already an objectification going on. Almost as soon as we had our first sexual encounter, I started using that. So the point for me at which I started to pick up the porn again came very quickly. And it came because reality set in. And the reality beyond the honeymoon phase comes down to the fact that my wife was not me. She had different desires. She had a different way of looking at the world. If I was hot, she was cold. I wanted the window down. She wanted it up, right? These differences in ourselves. I mean, we knew each other all of, less than a year before we got married. So we didn't have enough time to get to know the ins and outs of how we operated as individuals. So now as we're a couple, it was just me constantly running into opposition. And so very quickly, in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm not getting what I want. And my whole life, 20-some years of my life to that point had been about what I want. So if I wasn't getting it from her, I was going to have to get it somewhere else.
So with the the continued manipulation, trying to get your way, and as you talked about, the budding of the workaholism and perfectionism, from college, of course that doesn't stop, and continues just like the porn type stuff. So what is, you've got, if at this point, let's say a few kids, along the way, you don't have the complete five yet, and the porn is still happening. There's the anger, there's the arguments, so it seems though, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe the workaholism kicks in at this point and say, well, I can spend longer time at work. I can look for these excuses that I don't have to be home, that I can, this is for the job type thing. Was there anything like that, or
Sure.
or did it look differently?
I think in some ways, yes. For me, it was an outlet that helped me maintain. It was a way I could expend my energies intellectually, if not physically, because I worked in IT. It wasn't a labor-intensive job, but I could also have interactions with other people, develop friendships professionally, and occasionally get out and do some extracurricular things. Whether it was golf or bowling. There's a couple people that love to do that. But by and large, I think for me, the workaholism manifested itself in using work as another outlet for my energies. And it became a tool to maintain, my sanity, if you will, to re-energize in a way, so that I could go back into the home front and not completely melt down. So I don't know that I used work as an excuse to get away so much as just using it to medicate, more. I think it did. There were several occasions, as I think about it now, where I would opt to stay working as opposed to spending more time with the family in times that would be more like reasonable. For instance, there was a period of 3 years when we first moved to this area where we didn't go on vacation. I simply didn't take it. Not because I was trying to get more, time away, but like I didn't want to. And so because it was all about what I wanted, I would find ways to, get out and about, like do a 4-day weekend here or there, but we never really took any real vacation. And I think that was very detrimental to my wife and kids at the time. And it was during that time we had one of our breakups where she basically said, we got to get out. And so she went and took the kids, went and stayed with her parents for like 3 months, and in that time just said, figure it out. We need to be able to do something like go on vacation. So, yeah.
So yeah, and I appreciate you reminding me about the times of separation. So over that 8 or 9 years of marriage, in 2, 3, 4, I mean, how many different times did you guys separate, even if it's for a couple of days?
Well, I think 3.
3, okay.
Officials.
And was that 3-month stint the longest?
No, I think the longest was close to 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that, again,
there was some off and on in there, but
yeah, with her leaving and staying with somebody else, or you were always the one in the house, or you left, or.
Yeah, it was. In each occasion, she would leave and take the kids down to her folks.
So in my own experience, there's a number of times of separation as well, before recovery, and understand the idea behind that is to sort of have some time of self-reflection, introspection, try to kind of see, all right, where are things, sort of going off the rails, and what are some processes or some people I can connect with to try to, get things better.
Yeah.
I never did that. it was an opportunity of like, now I have 24/7 me time. Like, okay. And so obviously total wrong usage of the time. What did it look like for you during those periods of separation?
Very similar to what you just described. I think took advantage of the time for myself, but also there were in each occasion there was a mandate from her to say this needs to happen. In one case, it was, look, we can't be living in a tiny apartment anymore. We've got to get more space, single family home, like figure it out. Get us out of this place. I can't stay here anymore. Another time it was, the need to have some sort of involvement in our church community. This needs to happen. So there was some sort of expected outcome. Hey, we're going away until you get this sorted out. The last time, the last separation was the closest I was brought to seeking help prior to getting into recovery. Well, prior to my house of cards coming down, and that was because the mandate was we need counseling. So either you set up couples counseling for us, or I'm out. And I did, but it was very much a dutiful, I'm doing the thing, kind of robotic, going through the motions, set up couples counseling, and presenting the best face. I tapped into all of my manipulative resources to go into couples counseling and be truthful, share just enough of what was going on in me to meet the minimum requirement of, all right, he's working on his stuff, right? And again, just adding yet another layer to that house of cards.
So the last thing to cover before getting into the house of cards, and this is more of a setup to where things are currently for you, and we'll get to that towards the end. But the teamwork. So in marriage, it's supposed to be a team effort. We're supposed to work together with our partners and do life. And up to this point, a lot that I can identify in your story that fits in mine, and that is, me time, and it's all about me, the manipulation. I hear the mandates from the first wife as during the times of separation. Any memories that you have, and I'm sure on a small scale there was teamwork efforts, but anything that really stands out, say this really looks good. We were operating as a team, or did that just not happen?
No, good call out. They did indeed. We both were aligned on one thing, and that was that we wanted to raise our kids as well as we could in the faith. And so we did that. And I think earlier in the segment here, I talked about in revealing our pregnancy to our parents, we received love and support, despite the fact that we knew the consequences could have been much worse, right? As being a God shot, as yet another indicator to me at the time, had I been aware of it, that hey, there's a door open here to come back, right? To leave your to break away from the cycle of corruption that you've involved yourself in, and that you perpetuate. Well, my wife was another one of those God shots, right? Yes, we both came from broken environments, but she was also, or is, an incredibly good person. She's deeply faithful. She had a relationship that I did not have with God. She also did not suffer from the type of emotionally flatlining compulsion of self that I was struggling with. She has a very deep heart and capacity to love and ability to connect with others. And so through all of this, I talk about she's the one who left in these separations. She's the one who made the demands. It's because it came from a much healthier place than I was at, right? God was working through her as best he could to try to pull me out of myself, right? And so she, I respect her deeply, and I still love her for that. She's an amazing woman. And throughout, she was looking for every opportunity to connect with me and to be a team and develop a partnership, right? I've learned since that's the case. That's how it was. That's who she is. She's a good woman. I was the one who fought that tooth and nail, though I didn't realize it at the time. I was just, this wasn't what I wanted. So my way or the highway. And I mean, today I look back and realize she put in a heroic effort to get as far down the line as she did before things, fell apart. So I think it's important for me to say this up front. It's like I hold her, in no way culpable for, the breakup of the family. That was on me.
Yeah, and appreciate that honesty, and hopefully there's some connection to folks watching this that they can take something away from that. And so, in that resistance to sort of the godly connection, the appropriate connection in marriage, was there now having the ability to look back on it, the hindsight, was there a resistance to sort of that godly connection with the kids and yeah, I'll just sort of leave it at that.
Yeah, well, sure there was, but I masked it for myself, right? I had all the book knowledge, and I had the intellectual capacity to breeze through the catechism and teach our kids, all they needed to know about our faith and answer questions and present very well, at church and in the context of other, faithful families and, etc. So, externally, I was everything that they, needed out of a good Christian dad, except the fact that I wasn't, right? Internally, I was just going through the motions. And that has an impact. Like, the kids could tell that I just wasn't there emotionally, right? I was cold. And, the time and effort that I gave to their faith formation and to the development of relationship between us was prescriptive. It was kind of, just perfunctory. It was just what I was doing as dad, as my duty, right? Yeah.
So I guess we can move into sort of the difficult stuff now. Of you mentioned a few times the house of cards,
Sure.
come falling down. What's that look like?
Well, yeah, it is. It is very difficult, but it's also something that absolutely needs to be said. It's part of my recovery to acknowledge the brokenness that I wrought in the lives of our kids and my former wife. And I think it's important to state up front that this is in no way an excuse. There's no minimization of the the horrible impact that my selfish decisions had in our family, but also a recognition that by the time this is 2011 thereabouts, our oldest was 7 at the time, and my wife was 7 or 8 months pregnant with our 5th. And by this time, I had become so desensitized and so just kind of ambivalent to the needs of the family and what was proper and right, for a father to be doing, that I was taking great risks in finding that me time. I would be acting out, behind the counter in the kitchen while the family was watching a movie Saturday nights, right? Because I could step away and make coffee or something. that's super risky. Like, they could just turn around and see something was going on. And that behavior became more and more risky. And so the first card to fall was when my daughter caught me, with my hand in the cookie jar, as it were. And my reaction to that was about the coldest type of reaction that could be given, one that no father should ever, present their daughter with, or any child for that matter. But I excused it and made it. I tried to normalize it, saying, "Well, this is just what Daddy does, and let's keep this a secret." I recognize, in hindsight, that was my fear of being found out, my inability to recognize in the moment the gravity of the situation, my pride in saying, well, I can control the situation by doing these things. And at no point in time was my heart or mind, aware of my daughter. Right? She was just there, and I had a situation to deal with. Right? That situation was, what can I do to not get caught? Mm-hmm. And over the course of a couple of weeks, way too long, I nurtured that, and I tried to normalize it. And in the process, I violated her innocence, not so much physically, but I allowed her to see and touch me, and have those conversations that a 7-year-old never is not prepared for, not ready for, very inappropriate. And in my mind, I'm feeling like I'm gonna get away with this, and that final card was another God shot. God worked through her innocence to find me out, right? In that she talked with her mom and told her what happened. And in confronting me, my wife at the time was very ostensive. I mean, she was calm, but intense. And I had to answer. But I fought it. I denied it. I came up with all sorts of excuses and reasons and justifications, and just would not admit to having done anything wrong. And that was the last straw. And I very rightly, she packed up the kids and left, and did so under the cover of night. I had already planned to take the family out to my parents, and spend the next couple of months with them to give her the support she needed in giving birth to our 5th child, because we're out here, there really isn't a lot of family out, and we didn't know too many people in the community at that level. Mm-hmm. So the idea was, we'll go to my folks. And so while I went out that weekend, if you will, to take care of business, and she took that opportunity to pack up and leave, and called me on her way home to say, this is it. She said, I hope you can get help. And over the course of weeks and months, she made attempts to reach through, my anger. But ultimately, I wasn't giving in, and I almost came to blows with her parents. I really just kept digging that hole, and fought tooth and nail to get my way and to absolve myself. And the lies just kept coming, and ultimately, I was held accountable. They filed charges, and I went to court, and eventually pled guilty to a misdemeanor corruption of minors. I was very fortunate to be given the grace of not having to register as a sex offender, but I had to go through the program. And I was mandated by the state to a 5-year probation, under which restrictions kept me to the county, and prescribed me therapy, weekly, bi-weekly group sessions, monthly. What are the lie detector tests?
A polygraph.
Monthly polygraphs, and it was cold turkey. Like I had to break what was going on, and it was when that happened, my first realization, like the thick wall of my skull cracked a little bit and said, Nick, you need to get help. And so it was 2012, thereabouts, that I finally did, of my own accord, reached out, found a therapist who almost immediately gave me the call-in information for the Sexaholics Anonymous program and said, get yourself into a meeting. And so between meetings and, the state program, my probation restrictions, I was put in an environment where I had to face the consequences of my actions and, figure out what to do at that point.
So the first wife takes kids, packs up, leaves, doesn't come back, and you go through the court proceedings that are pushed forward by her and her parents, and all that comes out. The relationship with the kids, what did that look like, during that period of time?
Sure. Well, for all intents and purposes, my relationship with my kids was a good one. But as I mentioned before, I just wasn't there emotionally. I was going through the motions. And so through therapy, I've had a lot of good people with a lot of experience help me understand that they may very well have been, loving and have a relationship with me, but there may have also been a certain amount of distance and confusion. Little kids pick up on things that us adults don't always identify. And so, unfortunately, no, I say unfortunately, but there is some hope there which we can tap into later on. But the difficult thing for me was coming to terms with the fact that in her leaving and taking the kids and facing these legal consequences, it was a very real possibility that I may never have a relationship or have the opportunity to have a relationship with them. So it was a complete severance. There was a period of time where, as the legal proceedings went on, we made an attempt at mediation, at some sort of visitation policy, but we were quite distant. A plane ticket needed to be acquired in order to make the trip, right? Or a long day and a half drive. Mm-hmm. So we're distant. The logistics were difficult to make that happen. But I was still very angry when we tried to make those attempts at mediation, and I think I burnt the bridge there even further, right? I just kept throwing matches on the fire. And so by the time my sentence was handed down, it was pretty clear to me that at least until the kids turned 18, their fate was in the hands of their mother and the family, who I had very completely disowned. Right? I had removed myself from their good graces, absolutely. And I had to face that fact. that there wasn't going to be a relationship here unless God works a miracle. And it took me a while to figure out this part. That was going to depend on me. So yeah.
Okay. All right. So you're enrolled in some of the state mandated, programs. You find the therapist, counselor on your own. I start doing that. Immediately get directed to the SA, the Sexaholics Anonymous group, and so now you're basically in recovery, as far as meeting wise and timing and that sort of thing. Where's your mind? Is your mind in recovery, or is this just I'm sort of ticking the boxes?
Yeah. Yeah, well, the 12 steps, my mind was, all right, this is a 12-week program, and I can get out of here and move on with my life. I don't want to be here. I'm being forced to do something against my will. This is not what I want. There was a lot of minimization going on in my mind about why, I don't deserve this. Why me? I was very angry. But I was also determined to just, set my face like flint and pass on through, right? Just get it over with. Which is, I look back and, I want to meet myself at that point in time and, hit myself over the head with a frying pan. It's just like, it just boggles the mind that after everything that's happened in the last, 18 months, why are you still thinking this way? But
What year is this that you're entering into recovery?
Well, 2012, 2013.
Okay.
Yeah, in the midst there's, I found, so the exact timeline, my offense in late 2011, the sentence didn't actually get handed down till November of 2014. And it was in that time that found therapy, found SA, started, going to meetings. Then, but I was, again, during that whole time, just going through the motions, angry that I had to get a lawyer and start paying legal fees, and angry that everything was being taken from me. I felt that way. My family, my finances, everything I built, I looked at that as being incredibly unjust. Like the punishment far outweighs the crime, in my mind.
Mm-hmm. So you're going through all of this, obviously not identifying anything as far as your rock bottom at that point. If anything else, your bottom is being raised through the efforts of all of that has happened. And so, when did you identify and know that there's nothing else that I'm done, I'm spent, yeah. I'm finished. I need to actually get into and do this recovery thing.
Sure. It was a process, and I think that realization came in the form of little God drops, God shots along the way. The first was the proverbial house of cards coming down around me. Being separated from the family, facing the specter of legal consequences, because I got the subpoena and the house searched and all my electronics taken by the the police, and the initial interviews with detectives and things like that up front. But then there was a whole period of time where there was all this other litigation going on that I wasn't privy to, and I get these things in the mail saying, hey, you have to appear to court. So I was just stressed out. I didn't know what to do. And it was that moment that I had that first God shot of get help, like open up to somebody, and got a therapist. Once I started going to meetings, that was the next God shot. It was a repeat of the God shot where my parents were willing to accept me despite the the pregnancy. In that I walked into a room full of men who didn't reject me when I shared even a little bit of my story. I was shocked. I was like, all right, so I can just say what's on my mind here. And if anything, I'll get a pat on the back and encouraged to keep coming back. I go, okay, where do you find that? Another God shot that kind of led me along the way was getting into the state program, because the therapists there were incredibly experienced. They knew where I was, what I was going through, and they were the ones who identified, for instance, we talked earlier about me, loving to wrench on things and build stuff, and that had been completely absent from my life, and they recognized, hey, there's other things you can be doing aside from looking at porn and masturbating. Use it, right? Replace the unhealthy with the healthy. Mm-hmm. And that was it made sense, but it was the first time someone had actually spoken it to me in a way that I just made sense. I was like, wow, that could actually work. Like, what does that look like? So progressive. The final God shot, if you will, was three years. I think we're looking at 2016. Recovery was, up to that point, a process of just getting it all out on the table. I had gotten a sponsor when I realized that I couldn't do this on my own. And that sponsor, beautifully had a huge heart and thick skin and just let me go through a whole bunch of relapses and getting up, trying again, before it dawned on me, through the grace of God and His guidance, that a big problem, a big part of my inability to break the cycle was a combination of my pride and my overconfidence in myself, where I would become complacent. I could get a few months of sobriety down, and in my mind, I'm like, all right, I got this. I can do it. And then I take the foot off the gas of my recovery work, the actions of going to meetings, of working the steps with my sponsor, of calling people in the program, of going to church, of praying, of having a life, built on purpose. I'd kind of slack off and I'd say, okay, I can take it easy now. I got this, and relapse. So in 2016, that last relapse came. I'm on probation. I'm up for another polygraph. One of the conditions of probation is no porn. Like, that could violate my probation and have a lot of negative consequences. Well, I looked at porn. I looked at porn for a whole weekend and acted out. And knowing that, hey, this could have really negative consequences. Fearful of what those might be, but just unable to not do it. And it was because I realized at the moment this didn't happen overnight. This was a weeks-long progression of me, giving in to little things here and there, entertaining the thoughts, not doing the healthy right next thing, not reaching out, not telling my sponsor something's going on in my head. I just, I tried to manage it. And somehow, on January 11th of 2016, I had a moment where I had enough internal courage and humility to say, I can't do this. And the first person I called was my probation officer. Because I knew, if I admit to this, stuff's going to happen. Mm-hmm. I called her, told her what happened, and she said something I'd never forget. She said, have you talked to your sponsor? I said, no. She said, call him. She hung up. She didn't even give me a chance to respond. She's like, call him. Click. And I realized in that moment, she's giving me grace, right? It was in a way she said, you haven't said anything to me yet. Talk to him first, right? And that gave me, a moment to reflect that, hey, there's a greater plan here. It's not mine. Do the next right thing. So I called my sponsor and got back on the horse, as it were. Went to a meeting and began to do that. and it started to change my approach to this. That it's all right. This isn't just a set of check boxes, like you said. This is good. I have to relearn how to live. I have to relearn what it means to be a contributing member of society in relation with those around me. It's not about me. I have better language to describe that today than I did then, but I think the knowledge was there. Like it had manifested itself as a heartfelt understanding that this needs to happen. So
2013 to say January 11th, 2016. 3 years there. You mentioned it, early on with the house and sort of get through the detectives and electronics taken, that sort of stuff. And still living at that house the whole time. What's your living situation look like during that 3 year period?
Well, a lot changed. I started by renting space in the house because I was starting to spend a lot of money on attorneys and
So you've got housemates that you're bringing in. Okay.
Mm-hmm. That soon became unmanageable, and when I realized that the legal things I was going through were starting to conflict with being able to get people to rent, because nobody wants to rent a house where there's going to be police showing up every week or so to check in. Right? So I sold the place and started renting. And at the time, this was before the sentence was handed down, I was renting down in Maryland, not far from my office. And that worked out great. In fact, I developed a couple of very healthy relationships from that experience because one of the guys that was renting with me was also in recovery. But that changed once my sentence came down because I couldn't leave York County without permission. I got a standing travel permission for work, which was a blessing, but I had to find a place to stay kind of overnight. And I didn't really know this was one of the consequences. My attorney at the time wasn't clear on what exactly would come. So there was a period of time after my sentence was handed down in 2014, about 2 weeks where I was living out of my car because I didn't have anywhere to go. All my stuff was in Maryland. I couldn't leave the state. And so, I was kind of hard up. But I'd been, going to meetings. And so at the next meeting I was able to get to after my sentence was, after I was sentenced, was I shared that I was looking for a place to stay. And very soon after, I got a brother in the fellowship who offered his place to me. And though I was only there for 2 weeks, it had a profound impact on my life. And then other fellows came out, and eventually I had found a kind of a roach motel to set up what I thought was going to be the duration of my probation. It was super cheap, but you get what you pay for. The place was just absolute trash. And one of the fellows in the program helped me move in. And so he's helping. He comes up the stairs into this little room that was like, the windows had a privacy film on them, or so I thought. But I soon came to find out that it wasn't privacy film. It was years of cigarette smoke buildup on the inside of the windows. Just absolute, they're just really deplorable situations. But he comes up the stairs bringing some stuff and kind of looks around and goes back down to the car. And I came down to get more things, and he says, "Nick, I talked to my wife. You're going to stay with us." And so I ended up staying with them for just over 2 years. And in that time, that allowed me to get my feet back under me. He was being in recovery, he was able to, in a way, kind of be my first sponsor and kind of guide me without being sponsor in name. He was influential in helping me understand that I needed a sponsor. So yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, so it seems that, January 11th, 2016, you know, the wake up call, maybe not, the true rock, bottom. It seems like that maybe has already happened, prior to that. But, this is the true sort of, awakening to, I really want to do this. I really need the help. I'm tired of living, and feeling the way that I've been, all these years. More of the head knowledge and heart knowledge is coming into play in this. And so, what's recovery look like at that point? I'm assuming the 12-week, 12 steps, mentality has been removed, and now you've got a fresh set of eyes. What's it look like?
Yeah. Well, by this time, I have a sponsor. I am working the steps. And I also have a broader support group, guys that I can talk to about the stuff going on in my head. I've also had experiences through therapy and through the state program that have helped me come to terms with some of the biggest pain in my life at the time. The biggest one being the separation from my family. Initially, that was incredibly difficult to wrap my head around. One, because I hadn't yet fully come to understand the severity of my my offense, and how it impacted everyone, all my kids, right? My wife, her family, my family. Like there's the tidal wave of destruction that caused was massive, and I refused to acknowledge it for way too long. Another major pain was just the dealing with myself, this intense loneliness and feeling of failure, that somehow all of my work and all of my plans came to nothing. It was kind of this idea I had in my head that I was like, all right, what good am I if I can't do this thing? Because all my self-worth was tied up in what other people saw. Right. The state program, the therapists there really dug into the impact of my upbringing, or the contribution that the situations of my upbringing had to, and the addiction had to how I had built this kind of relationship-less existence with my family. They also helped me rewrite my vocabulary around what I was feeling, helped me apply words that meant something to what was going on in my heart. Because when I first got into this, I was either angry or sad, right? Variations of angry.
Mm-hmm.
I was pissed. I was frustrated, or sad. There's variations of, kind of depression or self-pity, right? But I didn't have a lexicon. I didn't have a way of describing what was going on. And as a result, I was very good at minimizing everything, right? I minimized just even the way that I was talking to myself in my head was minimizing the gravity of my offense, was minimizing the way, the unhealthy ways in which I related to my wife and kids, right? Lots of, justifications for, well, this is why that happened, right? I never pointed the finger at myself, So, yeah, it took some time, but with a lot of help, I think the events of that, I say final relapse, but the last relapse, because I know now I have another one in me,
Mm-hmm.
and it could very well be my last, and I don't want to go there. But that on January 11th, 2016, there was that heartfelt realization that I couldn't do this on my own, and that it's going to require relearning how to live, right? And it starts with the relationships that I have with those around me, and my faith, right? I realized, I think, in my heart at the time that I had to get out of my head, that my head and my heart were miles apart, right? And I was just living up here all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It was a form of control. I needed to connect the two and allow myself to open up to the input of a power greater than myself, and to acknowledge that I'm not in control.
So, what does that relationship with God look like and at that time, and how has that grown since then?
Yeah. Well, the relationship was, I wouldn't really call it a relationship. It was kind of a mutual existence. I knew God existed. I believed in God. I had an intellectual understanding of what my faith taught about God. But I was using God as a tool to get what I wanted out of people through influence and trust, ill-founded trust. And that had to be refactored. But it started with me breaking. I had to break. I had to let go somehow, or have it taken from me, the idea that I had any influence over these externals. I hate to say this, but it's true. I was not going to change were it not for the consequences of my actions manifesting themselves physically, reality in my life. I needed that. And I can sit here today and it's amazing to me that I can be grateful today to God for that house of cards coming down. I can be grateful that my wife at the time had the immense courage to pack up and leave. Right. That the people around me had the tough love capacity, to allow and force me to face the consequences that were overdue. Because had it not been for that, I wouldn't have changed on my own accord. Given that, I'm also deeply grateful that God put in my heart the capacity to let go, right? A capacity to get off my high horse and let someone else take the reins. Because I've seen that in other people's lives where it's not the case, right? The self is so ingrained that, at least yet, there are still people I know who haven't gotten there. But I also know it's possible, even for the hardest of heart, because God can do all things. I was a pretty hard nut to crack, and I'm grateful that he cracked it. So my relationship now is one, I think, that is much more closely aligned to what I believe a relationship between a father and son can be. Where my earthly father loves me unconditionally, is also bound by the limited capacity of being human, and just doesn't have that emotional capacity, to give me the time that I might want or need at any given moment, whereas God does, right? He's always there. He will always respond, right? And so that relationship, I think, now has the capacity and the ability to underpin every other relationship as long as I let it. And that's a big part of my ongoing recovery effort, is to recognize in the moment that I'm starting to stray from the path here, right? Whether it's by my thoughts and how I'm letting my feelings, direct my decisions, right? Constantly aware that I can't be complacent. And it's helpful. You look around in my home, there's constant reminders that I am part of both the physical and the spiritual world. I used to think that, religious pictures and images and iconography were just kind of, leave that in the church. Right? I'm realizing more and more I need that, because I need that physical, material reminder that God is real. He's here. He's active. And as long as I can keep tapping into that abundance of, love and acceptance, then I can keep going.
So the past almost 8 years of you and I knowing each other, we've been witness to and benefited from just being a part of and seeing each other's journey and the growth to where we are as we sit here today. And so the relationship with God, and starting to grow that and being the underpinning to every other relationship that happens from there. If you can, you sort of tap into when you knew that there was something different happening in you, the way that you related to other people, not from a romantic standpoint. Obviously that was some years after that, but just friendship building, or within the fellowship of the room, or just an pure interaction with strangers. Is there anything that you can harken back to and say, okay, yeah, I think this is when this started. This is how it started to manifest in my life?
Well, I think that, I was first in my upbringing, I was exposed to what a good relationship looks like, in that my parents loved us and supported us and could see past and through our disobediences and stuff like that. And I say ours, like me and my siblings. I was part of this community. As an individual too, I can look back and see that examples of good relationship were spread out throughout my life, including my former wife, who worked tirelessly to try to reach through my facade, and all of those relationships in their healthy environment had one thing in common, and that was that they were giving, not taking. In stark contrast to my relationship with the world, which was, what can I get out of this situation? What's in it for me? Mm-hmm. Gimme, 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 gimme. Right? I'm taking everything, giving nothing back. And I encountered that again in the rooms when I came in and shared a bit of my story and received. Nobody said, hey, do this thing for me, tell me this thing, give me more. It was, thank you for being here, keep coming back. It was just giving of their acceptance, of their time. My sponsor, other fellows that I started to meet in the program, yourself, right? The relationships were founded on giving as opposed to taking. My relationship with God, I realized that's all he did was give, right? He needed nothing from me, so I couldn't give anything to him, right? It was pure gift. Mm-hmm. So realizing that and turning that mirror, or looking in the mirror and saying, well, what am I giving? There was a point in time where that was nothing, right? I wasn't giving anything. I was taking everything. I could convince myself that I was giving something, right? I was, building a future for someone, or I was, contributing money to the, the coffers at church, or I was, but it was all self-serving at the end of the day. It was, look at me. So that's where, my understanding of relationship with God, with myself, and with others had to start with gift of self. The challenge was, I also came face to face with the wisdom and reality of the slogan, or the saying we have in recovery, but elsewhere too, that you can't give what you haven't got. Right? It's a logical fact. Mm-hmm. I want to give you this mug, but if I don't have it, I can't give it. And that applies to everything that I do. I can't give love or give of my time or give of my, my experience, strength, and hope if there's nothing there. If the only thing there is the next thing for me. So they go hand in hand. The gift of self starts with a healthy self. So I recognized this took time to develop, and help from therapy, and my sponsor taught me that I have to get healthy first before I can be healthy for others. Even though I may want to be healthy for another person and have all the right things to say, spiritually, it's disconnected. It's just me spouting words, and there's nothing to back it up. So, a big part of this actually comes in a major motivator for me in recovery is actually the relationship that might be possible with my children. So, I talk about our separation. I was last in physical proximity with my kids in 2013. And even then, our youngest, who was several months old at the time, I haven't met yet. Whether or not I will, that's up to our Lord at this point. I don't know. I hope so. But the motivator in my recovery that's kind of helped build a foundation of altruistic approach here is that I'm recognizing for the first time in my life to date that in getting healthy and learning how to give that to others, I can become the best version of myself so that, God willing, I can encounter my kids again, my former wife, any family and friends that they have, that they will meet the father, the husband, the other member of this community of faithful that should have been there for them, that God intended from the beginning that I be healthy, and they can receive from me that love and that unconditional acceptance of their being, and know that I love them in return. And that's a big reason of why I commit myself to a program and to a lifestyle that fosters a positive sobriety, a sobriety that looks at the good fruit that comes from living rightly.
Amen to that. I mean, that's absolutely true. And a word that's bouncing around in my head based on what you were just sharing is trust. And so, in order to sit down, on this podcast and tell your story in great detail, it says a lot about your trust in God and what He would do, with your story. Like in anything, there's going to be, naysayers, detractors, people trying to point out the negative stuff. Yet I think that is going to be, or our prayer is that is, white noise in the end, that all of the positivity and the growth of to where you are today is what shines through to whomever may see this. Mm-hmm. And so in the trust that you have in God first, then the ability to trust in you and your own decisions and your own motives, that you're moving away from being a taker to a giver, then I believe helps breed positive relationships with other people, because you can begin to trust them. You have an expectation in yourself that you can be trusted, and that gets proven through actions. So that happens from the house that you live in, the first time with a few other guys, and that's my recollection of the first story I ever heard about you and your giving. There's a brother that comes in and needs a place to live, and you immediately offer up your room to him, and you move into the living room or some other place within the home, and so that and that gets spoken about often, by this particular individual, and your approach to it is humble in the way you receive that, at least from my experience in hearing that. And so and then it just builds from there. That's, because then I start to come into, the program, and I begin to know you. You actually are my first sponsor through the program. And, there's a tremendous, growth and help that you give me there. And so at some point you decide I'm at a place where I believe I can be a healthy partner to somebody else. And so you start to entertain the idea of dating, and what that might look like. And I'm sure that even happened before you actually took the step and acted on the courage and the faith to put your foot into the dating pool. So what's that journey look like? When do you start thinking about I think I'm healthy enough to do this? And then when do you pull the trigger? What's the time frame look like for that?
Oh boy. Well, yeah, getting to that, there's a lot of growth that takes place, and a lot of trial and tribulation in between. First, getting into the rooms and realizing that, hey, relationship is a gift, of self, and that it's a two-way street, and that there's all these unknowns, and that I need to be able to be in a place where if things don't go the way I anticipate, right, that it's okay. I have to have a fairly healthy understanding of and relationship with what it means to have an expectation of something, right? And for me, it was pinned on a need for a period of physical abstinence, right? And that was about it ended up being 8 or 9 years of abstinence from sex of any kind. Also, a abstinence and a conscious effort to reframe my approach to and relationship with women in general, right? Breaking apart the mold I'd formed in my life of seeing them almost unconsciously as objects of my own pleasure and my own, whatever, right? That took some time. Took some time to practice the principles of recognizing other people, male or female, as human, as deserving of my respect and my love, in a purely Christian sense, that God created them to be with me in communion and loving Him by our love for each other, right? And that love is not, it's not limited to just people I like,
Right.
Or that are attractive, or that, do something for me, right? It's unconditional. It's a love that has to come from the heart and be freely given. And by freely, I had to come to learn that by giving something, I can't expect something in return for it to be healthy for me, right? Other people may have different experiences, but I built so much of my prior life predicated on what can I get out of this situation that it's actually toxic for me to go into a certain, a relationship of any sort with an expectation of receiving something in return. Now, granted, I go to the store and I pay someone money to buy something that's an exchange, that's practical. That's not what this is about. This is about, the value attributed to an interaction with another human being. That I'm here to give what I have, not more, right? That's helpful too, because I'm also very good at propping myself up and being, putting on britches that are way too big, right? And letting everyone know, I'm the best. But I set myself up for failure when I do that, because I'm not. I'm human. I have failures. I'm constantly a work in progress, and so I can't expect to give more than I've got to give. I have to know what that is. So, those reminders are constant. But yeah, I know that was a bit much, and I actually forget your original question.
Just about when the thought of dating
Oh, that's
popped in
right.
your head, and then when you decided, okay, I'm going to go for it.
Yep, I knew there was more to it, because that gift of relationship, that gift of love, is the underpinning for understanding for myself that I was ready for a relationship, because I could encounter other people, and I started being able to identify for myself in my interactions with coworkers, family, friends, people, random strangers. When I took an honest look at that interaction, I could say, hey, I'm actually here to learn about this person, to give where I have the opportunity to receive if given. And there's no strings attached, right? Emotionally, expectation wise. And I could confidently say to myself, you know what, not only do I want this, because I've wanted it throughout, right? It's not like my sex drive or my need for, intimate relationship just evaporated during those, years that I was abstinent. In fact, it increased, right? It became more and more like a real to me that, hey, I'm made for this, right? I was called to be in communion with other people. And so women became even more attractive. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, that attraction was of the right sort. It wasn't based on how they looked, so much as who they were. And I couldn't know who they were without a conversation, without an exchange of experiences. And that was something that, opened up a whole new world of amazingness to me in the relationship. And it was guided by therapy and my sponsor and other people who had been there before, who could recognize where I was to help me understand, hey, Nick, this is an opportunity, right? You may be onto something here. Have you considered possibly dating? I think the question first was posed by my state program therapist, who would often ask guys, coming in the room to talk about their relationships. And it was posed pretty directly to me as, are you ready to date? Well, have you thought about a girlfriend? My gut response to that, I think, helped me kind of in the moment. I had two thoughts going on. One was the response was, I want to. And the other, the part of that was, I think I can. Like, I think I'm ready for that. And that recognition that it wasn't a, excitement of, hey, I'm about to get a, new gadget or go to the candy store or take a trip, right? It was more of this real desire to find someone with whom I could share my experiences. And a telling thing for me is, at the time, my first thought was not, oh crap, they're going to have to know my story, right? That came later. But I recognized that when it came, I realized, oh, there were a whole lot of other healthy things that came before that. And so that when it did come, the realization that I'm going to tell my story to this stranger who may just run screaming from the room, right? I wasn't afraid of that. But that kind of leads to maybe a quick interlude here to when that did happen, and I eventually met the woman who's now my wife. It was heavy on my heart that I be completely honest with her about my background, where I was today, how I got here. And no question in my mind in meeting this woman for the first time that the next time we meet, I'm going to tell her my story. Right? So our first date, hit it off. We, talked each other's ears off. I mean, shut the place down. The proprietor of the place we went was very generous. Eventually came over 2 hours after closing and said, guys, I want to go home. But we hit it off. And even then, I knew, well, not only do I see something in this woman that is incredibly attractive to me, but I want this person to be a part of my life. And in order to do that, she's going to need to know my story. And so our second date, I did just that. And I didn't couch it with a lot of excuses. I just said, I need to tell you about myself. And she heard my story. And I ended it by saying, this is really hard to say. And her first response was, well, it should be. And then she had a few clarifying questions and then thanked me for sharing my story.
Okay.
And that also, another God shot, blew me away. I fully expect her to be like, well, thank you. Have a nice day.
Well, we'll get into that some more. We'll take another quick break, and then I want to backtrack because I forgot about LHQ. I want to talk about that and the relationships of the guys in the house, and then we'll jump back into the relationship that you have now.
All right.
Okay. Coming back in from the break, wanted to talk about the last house that you were a part of before eventually getting remarried and having your own place again, and we'll be touching on that. But you had said that there was some growth and there were some things that you identified for yourself through just the interactions with the different guys who came and went in this house that not only you lived in, but there were 3 different times that I visited back and had various stays there myself through my own journey. And so wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of talk about that and see how that affected your recovery growth.
That was a big part of my recovery experience overall, and the building of the support group that I have now, which is amazing. Earlier in this segment, I talked about the consequences of being, handed this misdemeanor, and the probation restrictions I was under basically uprooted me from where I was living, and I had to jump through a bunch of hoops to find a place to live. For about 2 years, I was living with a brother in the fellowship, and his wife took their son's room in the attic and kind of got my feet under me. But it became evident that as I grew in recovery and started to build my relationships, I was ready to then move out, let them have their space back,
Right. Yeah.
and get back out on my own, which was important for me. I needed to take accountability. I needed to, contribute. So I got in touch with a couple other fellows, and we got a place to stay, and started renting, and sharing that space. And almost organically, that space became a mecca for people people in recovery and the recovery community to gather, and to, whether it was, sponsors to meet with their sponsees or just to share some fellowship time, that became kind of a space to do that. And it was in fairly close proximity with where we normally met for meetings. And given that the other fellows there were also in recovery, it was just kind of a natural progression of how things went. Getting to that place, though, involving yourself and others in the fellowship, I think we started to recognize the importance of having that space, the importance of a place to go and to fellowship, and whatever the circumstances are. One, it's a roof over your head, and it's a responsibility to upkeep and pay rent. But it also became clear that, hey, we need to be able to expand on this, and we want to share it with other people. And over time, we found another place just outside the city, right off the highway. We called it now the Loganville headquarters, LHQ. And it's, it gave us a place to expand on that idea that we could start to involve other folk, other fellows in the program, and make space available to people who might need it. So that was the underpinnings of a couple things that we'll touch on here. But for me, we ended, just prior to the last break, talking about relationship. living with other men in recovery is very different, in my experience, from living with other men not in recovery. I'm thinking back to college, and any other time where I encountered other guys. Because in recovery, there are a number of very specific attributes of that relationship. One is we're all trying to get better in our minds, in our hearts, and there are a number of boundaries that have to be upheld to keep the space sacred. And in developing those relationships, there's a lot of friction. Friction within myself, trying to overcome my defects, and then encountering the defects that others are struggling with. So a real training ground. I mean, it was like, recovery boot camp in a way. To be put in a space with other men in recovery and learning how to get along and, do the basic stuff of, delegate chores and hold each other accountable to keeping this, the sanctity of the space, whether it's, rules about, alcohol or, pornography or, comings and goings and being in communication with each other about that. Just you're trying to live as a family, having only met each other, less than a year ago or even shorter, But over time, that training ground allowed me, I know, but I hear it from yourself and others that have had a similar experience, is profound. I mean, it has a profound impact on my ability to relate with other people, to accept that another person's going through something that I may or may not fully understand. I may be able to empathize, I may not, but I have that opportunity in the moment to let go of myself and my expectations and enter into whatever it is they're dealing with and help be a support, if only just by my presence. Fortunately and amazingly, in my experience, I've been able to help in many ways beyond just being there. So this most recent place had a lot of space in the garage and gave me the opportunity to really tap into my old haunts and my old hobbies. And I literally built a shop, with tools of all sorts and, the ability to build whole motorcycles from scratch and work on cars and, small engines and really just kind of give my time there to anyone who wanted to, join in the fray. And so that turned into a real kind of apostolic effort in a way for me to give of what I had, which was knowledge of how things work in such an environment, and then see the growth of others that got involved in that, whether they were motorcycle enthusiasts or not. One of my sponsees, went through the idea that he wanted to buy and fix his own motorcycle, got really into it, and then realized about halfway through the project that, no, this isn't for me. So I was left with half-built motorcycles. So what do I do with that, right? And all of a sudden it became this thing that could really, bring people together and, share in that experience. And I know he benefited, I did too, in more ways than one. And so, that's become a hobby that now carries forward. My free time can be put towards that if I so choose.
So when those lessons learned through the friction of the relationships within the house there, I'm assuming that was helpful in getting back into the dating world and going that process. So any memories of the dating time that you had to tap in and say, okay, this is one of those potential friction times, and here's the tool that I've got to use to not allow this become a big blow up.
Sure. I think one of the things that's come up most often in relationship with others that I had a lot of opportunity to practice at the house, learning how to live with these other guys in the fellowship, is something that in my prior life I kind of took for granted. And it's interesting because growing up as the oldest of 10 kids, I always leaned on that as a reason why I could, deal with other people. I could lead groups of people. I could do these things in relation to people that could achieve an outcome, right? So I always used that as my reason. I grew up in a big family. I can do these things. Well, I never really entered into relationship in a way where I allowed myself to be on the receiving end of someone else's pain. With my siblings, I was in charge,
Mm-hmm.
my way or the highway. We did things the way I wanted to. If you didn't like it, too bad, right? And I never got emotionally involved in whatever they were going on, what they wanted to do. So the big friction for me was being able to take a back seat in the relationship and allow the other person to say, this is what I want. This is what I need. Here are my boundaries. Nick, do these things and we'll get along, right? That was antithetical to me. Don't tell me what to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of practice there because I was given it, I wasn't the only, potentially alpha person in the room, right? I had other people who held me in check because they also had needs. They also had desires. And going into the dating world, I think that really helped. That helped me understand it's not about me. And the only way I'm going to really get to know this other person is if I let them tell me what they want, what they like, how they operate, all the things. I could let my guard down, be vulnerable, give myself over to learning about another person intimately, and actually listen, right? Listen with the intent to understand, not with the response queued up, right?
Mm-hmm.
My knowledge. So yeah, that was probably the biggest thing coming out of that in the dating world, in going into that, which was interesting because when I first put my foot back in the dating world, we're mid-pandemic, right?
Mm.
So there were a few people who were willing to meet in person, but everything else was at a distance, and that was not. I'm not used to that. It was my first time ever doing online dating, for one. But I also had to just kind of swallow my pride a little bit and let other people in, even if it was a remote interaction. I think I got a lot more out of it with that attitude, and that was forged in the fire of learning how to live rightly with other guys.
So, what was the fear level getting back into dating after so many years of just doing your thing and recovery?
Mm. I think initially there was a good amount of anxiety, but it was driven by future tripping, these kind of natural instinct to try to anticipate the outcome. Oh, these people aren't going to like me. My profile's not going to catch the right one. Whatever. But I would say that was short-lived. By the grace of God, I came to realize, hey, a big part of my success in this is going to be in direct proportion to my ability to trust in God, let go of my control of the situation. It doesn't matter. You put me out there, and God will find someone who's okay to meet that, right? Which is actually a good realization. I think I learned this time around that my idea of the perfect spouse, the perfect partner, could very well be flawed. My best thinking got me here. So what's to say I'm not going to just continue digging more holes in my life by doing the thing the way I want to, right? So letting the chips fall where they may, predicated on having been honest, put myself out there truthfully and not kind of painted a false picture, right? I'm not catfishing anybody here. I'm putting me out there. This is who I am. This is what I'm about. The realization that God's got a plan. He's found someone, and He'll help connect those dots. That was that helped quickly alleviate any anxiety. So I think that, the fear level quickly dissipated.
Okay. So you had said that you found somebody that first date, then you had a second date, and you trusted in God enough to trust your story to this person. They responded with love and grace, and we'll pick up from there. What did you continue dating the person? Did things fall apart? What happened?
Well, we're married now, so we continued dating, and that was another. I guess that in a way, my recovery took a level up. It was another level of accountability. It was another level of introspection and the opportunity to be faced with my defects, because in meeting this woman, it became very quickly apparent that she doesn't take or stand for any BS, which was scary but also very attractive at the same time, because I recognize this is someone that I can be real with, and not only is she not going to, let me get away with anything, but she's going to lovingly, be a partner in even the tough stuff. She's not afraid of anything. She's also very just, I guess you could say, just emotionally articulate. Right? She can identify what's going on and put words to it easily, which was amazing for me. I didn't have anyone with whom I had an intimate relationship that could really do that as well as her. And I came to learn this. But it didn't take long to learn that. I think my first lesson in that was in her response to having received my story. Right? She held me accountable to the fact that, yep, that's tough and it should be hard. Like I would question your motives if you weren't choking up right now. Like, that's a healthy response. Good on you. Right? And I needed to hear that. And it was natural for her to respond that way, which is a real blessing. So yeah, I think from there, our dates were very much, I would say, in a courtship environment. She made it very clear she didn't want any facade. Right. One of the things she said to me is like, the things you do to win me over can't stop when we get, at some point, right? Even before we knew we wanted to get married or made the decision together, right? That would be the end here, that we see if we can't make this a forever thing, right? She made it clear that, hey, I love it that, you've got water in the door of the car when you come to pick me up, or that you send me flowers at my workplace on my birthday, right? Don't stop that, keep that going. Is that really you? Or am I encountering something you put together to win me? Right? I needed to hear that. And knowing that she was not only willing to tell me that and hold me accountable to it, but she could do it in a way that was loving and caring, and it wasn't, she wasn't, bullying or haughty or anything like that. So that was amazing. I think that carried through. And when I think I should mention a little bit about the context in which we went into this, because in telling my story, what I failed to mention is on the first date, she told me, and this is kind of a flip reversal, if you recall early on, in my dating experience, I would set these kind of artificial boundaries of like no sex before marriage, right? Our first date, after introducing and kind of some small talk, she said, let me tell you this up front, but I'm not having sex until we get married, if that's what this leads to. And she said it very gently, but very firmly. And I received it well. Like I said, this is great. Like, this falls within what I need for my recovery. And so, fast forward a little bit, we get to the point where we both know this is serious. I haven't yet proposed, but we both know that could very well be an eventuality. I was of the opinion, because I'm working hard not to control the situation. I'm working hard in my recovery not to take. I want to give, right? So there's a bit of a blurred line for me in that mindset where I don't want to be overbearing and say, marry me, right? I want to know that she's ready, that that's what she wants as well. Not out of a fear of being rejected, but simply wanting to know that we're on the same page. And so I asked her, I said something along the lines of, will you let me know when you're ready for the next step in this relationship? No, both of us knowing what that meant. And she said, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would want you to let me have that grace. Excuse me. So that manifested itself very naturally. We'd just come back from her parents after celebrating someone's birthday, but it was a big event. Driving back, and we're talking about the experience and what the future could hold. And I had the inkling. I said, you know what, this might be an opportunity. Now I had planned ahead. I had a ring. I was ready to go, and it was just kind of burning a hole in my pocket for several weeks while I waited for this opportunity. But I think mutually we were talking about, this could be it. So it took her to a little wine bar north of Baltimore. We're sitting there, and I first, in the course of conversation, it became very natural for me to say, "Are we ready to take the next step?" And I think that's exactly what I said. And she said yes. And said, I said okay. So I went around the table, ostensibly to, because we had just gotten there, to put her jacket up, and I took a knee, popped the question right there, and it was great because one, we're on the same page. Two, she didn't fully expect me to propose right then and there, but that I was ready. We're both in the right mind space. It really was something else. So obviously she said yes, and yeah, we got married. So 6 or 7 months following.
All right, awesome. That's awesome. So to sort of, I guess, close things up to where we are today. So you had the first marriage with the kids and all that went with that. You've got the current marriage, and what are the lessons that through recovery, looking back on the first marriage, that let you just pick one or two that you definitely don't want to, that you've learned not to go down that route or to act that way, or basically the character defect that applies to that.
Sure.
But then also there's an asset, because we're not 100% bad and we're not 100% good. There's levels to it within our life. So what is something that you learned from the first marriage that is a positive in you that you bring into your current marriage? So one or two negatives, one or two positives.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest positive, and this is fueled by what I've learned through recovery in the development of relationships, a deepening of my faith, and the recognition that my role in all of this is it's participation, right? It's my involvement of my own free will in the lives of others for others, right? It's not for me. I got a lot of opportunity to practice the I guess you could say the logistics of being a husband and a dad in my first marriage, but none of I wasn't there emotionally or spiritually, right? So out of that, I think having had the prior experience now gives me the opportunity to focus wholly or more wholly on the relationship and my faith, right? That, okay, I've done the dad thing, not to minimize that, but yeah, I screwed it up, but I have an opportunity, given the grace to be a dad again, that I'll be much better for it based on the health of my relationship with God, myself, and my wife.
Mm-hmm.
So paramount, building that relationship. And then being able to find ways to just constantly be giving, paying it forward, never taking the gas off the opportunity to work the steps of my program realistically in my life, whether it's at the office, here with friends, neighbors, you name it. God gave me a short period of time on this earth to make the most of it, so get to work. Right? So I do that. And I'm allowed to, in a way, because I don't have in my prior marriage, I had the experience of these things, and I'm pretty confident going into the next one here now today that I can pick that up, but in a much healthier way. I would say that it's also the realization or the ability to recognize when I'm going off the track is heightened. Like I have a heightened sense of unhealthy thinking, unhealthy emotions, unhealthy responses to external stimuli, right? I can look back at my prior marriage and the life that we had and see what it looks like to start building up resentment, what it looks like to allow frustration to fester without being addressed healthily, right? What it would mean for that to come out sideways in anger, right? So in a way, there's the silver lining of having that experience, as negative as it was for my family, right? Now I can avoid that. It's like I've been down that road. I know what it looks like. I know where the potholes are and how to avoid them. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin, if you will. The other thing is this idea in recovery of a positive sobriety, right? It's not all about the drunk-a-log. It's not all about what happened and all the negatives that have come from it, right? That's part of the past. Mm-hmm. That's part of my experience. But I have an opportunity now to start building anew with quality material and involving others and starting to, clear away the wreckage of that past by living a much fuller life. And again, back to my motivator, right? I very much hope and pray that one day I'll be able to encounter my kids and former wife again and rebuild a relationship. There's a lot that would have to, happen for that to come about, but that's in God's hands.
All right, to close things up, because I think we're up to current as far as the life story. Yet I am aware of some ventures and things that you're involved with that are outside of your normal 9 to 5, so to speak, job and life here at home. There's some wrenching that you do as far as on the sides, sort of a side gig. I believe there's a nonprofit that you're involved with. There's some publishing or an ebook that you've written. So those are probably just a few things. There may be some more, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of talk about that, and because I think it's important as far as that hope piece of recovery. That it's not that we're just sick people getting well, but that that there is more for us to be realize about ourselves that we had no idea, through our sickness. So
it is, and it's amazing because recovery has not only given me, or living in a healthy way, but through recovery has given me more energy. But all that time I was spending on myself can now be spent in ventures that are much more uplifting and giving back. And yeah, I mean, in a way, the motorcycle shop is both a great outlet for me, but it's also community building, it's fellowship supporting, and it's a way for me to, give to others who may need it, and also involve them in good conversation and deeper questions about life and pursuit of happiness and things that are real, right, tangible. Kind of, it scratches the instant gratification itch, if you will, to know that, hey, I just built this thing, or I just fixed the thing. Look, you can hear it running, right? You can ride it down the road, right? It's very tangible. You talk about the other aspects of it too. That time is now spent towards paying forward some of what I've received, and Living Free Ministries as a nonprofit. Us and another brother of ours, kind of along the lines of our time on motorcycles, realized for ourselves that we've been blessed with so much, while fighting an addiction that has a lot of social taboo. Right, there are very few, if any, resources for the sexaholic as compared to, say, the alcoholic or the narcotic, addicted, chemical addictions. When you talk about sex, porn, it's not something people want to talk about. Nope. It's still very ostracizable. So let's build something. Let's put something together that can support the man struggling, with a sexual addiction, and that's that was the genesis of Living Free Ministries, and it's founded on the idea or on the experience of living in the house together, that we could really impact the lives of men by providing that type of home, where they can live in community, with a network of accountability and support, access to the resources that a sexaholic might need, whether it's knowing who to go to find good therapy, having a support network, where to find meetings, etc. Right. So just being able to foster that, and the activities that come with that turn people away from themselves and to community, right, brings them out. It's not about, you don't want to have, just this incubator of self. You want to draw people out and get them involved in their, in their fellowship, in their work, with the steps, etc. So that's what Living Free Ministry is about, and it's growing. It's fledgling. It's one of those things that faces a lot of headwind. One, it's sex addiction. Who wants to talk about that? Who wants to admit it? But we have the support of a lot of great people, and not too few churches and parish communities that are involved as well. So it's got legs, and I think God's behind it as well. Amen. So he's made a lot of things happen. And yeah, one of my, I guess you could say, another extension of my creative outlet is I decided to put my hand into the publishing experience. Some of it's based on my professional work, understanding how publishers and marketers work together, but also being interested in kind of putting to words some of my own experiences. So I've started with my first publication, which is centered on my experience and some reflections on what it means to ride motorcycles, and not just ride motorcycles, but ride motorcycles in any weather, right, throughout the year. There was a period of time in my early recovery where I had the opportunity to get a motorcycle, and I rode every day, several years. I put something like 80,000 miles on this bike in the space of a couple years, and it was my daily driver year round, unless it was icy. Mm-hmm. But I mean, and I learned a lot in that experience, connected with a deeper self there, and had time to kind of really think about things deeply. And so I tried to put some of that into this text. And we'll see. We'll go from there. The business model of what this publishing company looks like is still being formed. But yeah, it's been amazing, and I'm excited to see what comes of it.
Awesome. Well, maybe we can get some of those links or websites or whatever, and drop them in the info part of of the podcast. And if people want to connect, they can do that.
Sure.
In great detail, putting your life story out there to help others. Hopefully there was it seemed like there were some moments there where, things were realized with, for yourself, and there appears to be some help that was for you. Definitely for me, there's, some takeaways, for me to instill, in my own life. Before we close up, anything that I should have asked that I didn't, that you wanted to get out?
Not at all. Just the recognition that this podcast, I really hope, reaches a lot of people. The opportunity to get a few of these stories out into the public forum is quite amazing. And it's very hopeful to be able to let go of self and see what comes of the amazing fruit there. Christ is King.